Dear faithful friends who are blessed by Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, what if a fanatical Christian pastor who had been criticizing Islam all his life actually found the truth in Islam after experiencing a trial? What would he feel that made him willing to leave his faith? The Texas sky stretches wide, pale blue, with wispy clouds drifting lazily over the dry, barren plains. The small town of Midland is surrounded by oil fields that are constantly drilling into the earth, producing a humming sound that is a permanent background to the lives of its residents. In the middle of this tough, conservative town stands an old church with a simple bell tower whose white paint is starting to peel. Zion Baptist Church. This is where David W. Moore's name became known and respected. David was no ordinary pastor. His body was sturdy even though he was in his late 40s. His voice was heavy, deep, and authoritative, as if every word he spoke contained absolute truth. He knew how to hold the attention of his congregation, crafting rousing rhetoric and injecting humor that made them feel close to him. Every Sunday morning, the church was packed with people, minor families, housewives, even young people who would normally rather stay home. They all came for one reason: they believed in their pastor. But what really made David famous was not just his preaching of love and forgiveness, but also his tough stance on Islam. He repeatedly included warnings in his sermons about the dangers of foreign doctrines, of misleading Middle Eastern religions. He spoke out loud about how America must stand firm in its Christian heritage. In a town like Midland, his views were met with much applause. But David had a secret. When the church lights went out and the congregation had gone home, when his wife was asleep and night had enveloped their wooden house, he sat alone in his study. There, in almost painful silence, he opened his Bible and stared at the pages he had read 100 times. But those nights his vision was empty. He read, but felt unfulfilled. He prayed, but his heart remained empty. Something had been bothering him for years, a restlessness he had kept hidden, even from himself. Some verses in the scriptures he preached no longer answered his doubts. The impression of the oneness and divinity of Jesus he secretly questioned. One night, he was pensive for a long time after watching a journalist's interview with a young man. It was a test. That sentence, which he should have considered mere fanaticism, actually rang in his mind for days. But David never allowed himself to dig any further. He was afraid, not only afraid of the truth he might find, but also afraid of losing everything: his congregation, his reputation, even his family. He is the moral symbol of this small town. If he falters, then everything he has built will collapse. His wife, they have 2 grown children who are in college in other states. David rarely talks to them about his doubts, and to end, never. In their family, questioning is seen as a sign of weakness in faith. He led weekly Bible classes, visited the sick, baptized babies, married young couples, and buried the dead. He spread smiles, prayers, and wisdom. But it was all like a stage show that he played so well. One of his most cherished routines was to drive alone every Saturday afternoon to the outskirts of town, to a small, quiet hill. There he would sit in his car for hours staring at the horizon. He carried a notebook, but rarely wrote. Sometimes he would just close his eyes and ask himself, "God, do you hear me?" That day, a strong wind was blowing dust, and the sun was hanging low on the horizon. David turned on the car radio, but quickly turned it off again. He leaned back and took a deep breath. Inside him, there was a small voice that grew louder and louder, a whisper that he had thought was a temptation, but it began to sound like an invitation, a voice that said, "Seek truth, not justification." Tangled mind, face of the young Muslim man reappeared, with eyes full of peace even though he was in sorrow. One sentence of his repeated itself in David's mind. Everything, and without realizing it, in his tangled mind, the face of the young Muslim man reappeared, with eyes full of peace even though he was in sorrow. One sentence of his repeated in David's mind. Everything is a test. David opened his eyes. They were wet. He felt tired, very tired. At the tip of his heart, David opened his eyes. They were wet. He felt tired, so tired. At the edge of his broken heart, a question arose that he had been avoiding. What if it was my fault all along? The car sat on the hill until night fell, under a Texas starry sky. A revered pastor began to feel the first tremors in his faith, a small crack in the wall of faith he had spent years building, and like all cracks, it was only a matter of time before it collapsed completely. The dust sky hangs low over the barren Texas landscape as David W. Moore drives his Ford Expedition down Highway 67. The road is deserted except for the occasional oil tanker truck. A heavy growl, the wind swept across the desert surface, carrying dust in the scent of dry earth. On the passenger seat lay a folder of ministry notes in a worn black leather Bible, punctuated and scribbled on. David had just finished a ministry mission in a small town called Alpine, about 2 hours from Midland, and was now on his way home. That day, he preached about salvation, about how only faith in Jesus can free people from eternal damnation. The congregation responded enthusiastically, clapping. Some even approached him after the service, eyes welling up, asking for prayer and guidance. But behind the smile he spread, his heart remained empty. The victory that was usually intoxicating now felt bland, as if everything was just a formality that no longer touched the deepest part of his soul. He turned on the radio, trying to find a news channel. However, the radio only picked up country music from a local station. Fatigue began to creep up on him. David's eyes blinked heavily, his fingers tapping the steering wheel to stay awake. In the distance, the sun began to disappear behind the horizon, leaving behind an orange glow that slowly turned to gray. Then everything happened in an instant. A wild deer suddenly crossed the middle of the road. David slammed on the brakes in panic, but the wheels skidded on the flying sand. The car swerved to the right, hit the road divider, then rolled over several times before finally crashing to the bottom of the slope. The sound of metal clashing, glass breaking, and a loud bang echoed through the silence of the desert. Then silence. Only the roar of the wind could be heard again, as if sweeping away the traces of the tragedy that had just occurred. Several minutes passed before a passing truck driver noticed the overturned car wreck below and immediately called emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they found David pinned inside the cabin. His head was bleeding, his chest was barely moving, his heart was not beating. An officer stated in a tired voice that the man was dead. 7 minutes. 7 minutes of David's body lying amidst the metal debris as the night sky began to cover the West Texas sky. But inside him, something was happening, something that could not be explained by logic or measured by medical science. He felt no pain, no peace. He was only aware that he was no longer in that body. He looked down, seeing his own body, the blood on his forehead, the medic shaking his head slowly. Pitch without limits. No direction, no floor. Then everything went dark. Not dark like night, but pitch black without limits. No direction, no floor, no sky, just emptiness. David felt himself floating, as if pulled by an invisible force, further and further from the scene. The air became heavy, and in the distance came the sound of screams. The sound of people moaning, crying, asking for help. The sounds that filled the empty space cut to the bone. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to pray, but the words he usually said were gone. No strength, no hope. His body, or whatever was left of it, was simply floating uncontrollably, drawn by the ever-denser darkness. Amidst the chaos, vague images emerged, like snippets of a film of his own life. He saw himself standing in the pulpit, shouting about hellfire, about the heresy of other religions. He saw the faces of the congregation looking at him in awe. But then, the image changed to the faces of people who were offended, crying, feeling abandoned, the faces of the people he had been judging. He saw how his words hurt, how his hatred was expressed in the name of God. This is not salvation, he thought. This is not love. The voices grew closer. The screams turned to whispers. His ears rang. He felt judged, but not by a being or a judge, but by an undeniable truth. He felt naked, not physically, but in soul. And his conscience, every lie, every pride, every fear he had hidden was now exposed, mercilessly, just when he thought he could do no more. A light appeared, soft but strong, not dazzling, but warming. It was shapeless, soundless. But somehow he knew this was the way back, not home, but to the truth. It seemed to say, "Without words, you are not finished." And then in an instant, he was back. His body jerked. The medics holding the defibrillator froze. The heart monitor suddenly throbbed. An officer shouted, "He's alive! His heart is beating!" David opened his eyes slowly. The ambulance lights were blinding. The voices of the people were muffled. But inside him, everything had changed. He didn't know how to explain it. He only knew that he had gone and returned, and the place he had come to was not a dream, not a fantasy. It was real, too real. Now, in the silence of the journey to the hospital, lying on the emergency bed, David W. Moore was crying. The tears that flowed were not because of physical wounds, but because his heart was truly afraid for the first time in his life. The sound of the IV machine was beating softly in the corner of the room, rhythmic with the heart monitor that displayed a regular up and down line. The smell of disinfectant and antiseptic hung in the air. The thin curtains on the window let the morning sunlight in, illuminating David Moore's pale but alive face. He had spent 2 nights in the Midland hospital, and now for the first time, he sat upright in bed with a blanket covering his legs. His body still felt weak, but his mind seemed to be split in two. In the chair next to the bed, Ann sat with her hand holding her husband's hand. Still, but gratefully, he kept saying words of praise to God for the miracle that had happened. The doctor said David should have been dead. There was no pulse for 7 minutes. They had almost given up before the heart miraculously started beating again. But for David, those 7 minutes were not emptiness. He did not remember the screams of the ambulance, nor how his body was pulled out of the wrecked car. What he remembered was darkness. Not ordinary darkness, but a total emptiness that made time and space lose their meaning. No foothold, no boundaries, just darkness and screams. When Nancy asked in a soft voice, "What did you see, David?" her husband didn't answer right away. He stared at the window, swallowed, and then in a soft voice, as if afraid of what would come out of his mouth, he began, I was out of my body. I saw my own body, Nancy. I saw them trying to help me, but there was nothing I could do. Then everything went dark, and he held my hand. His face showed confusion and great curiosity. I felt pulled somewhere. Continued David. The place was like an infinite space, but not heaven. I knew it wasn't heaven because there were only screams, groans, and screams that made my skin crawl, as if I were among people tortured by their own regrets. And they knew I was there. David's breath hitched for a moment. His eyes stared blankly, as if the incident was still clearly pictured behind his eyelids. They looked at me, Nancy, but not with anger, but with hurt, with disappointment. They pointed at me. Then I saw myself, but not from my eyes, but from theirs. David straightened his body. Whose eyes are the people I preach to? Those I insult, those I dismiss in words I hold sacred. A Muslim woman who once sat in the back of our church, just to hear me. I remember indirectly driving her away through my sermon. She cried. I saw her tears again, but this time I knew why she was crying. The air in the room became heavy, as if the air itself held its breath, hanging on every word. David closed his eyes for a moment, then continued. I also saw creatures. I don't know what to call them. They had no faces, but I knew they knew everything about me. Not just my actions, but my intentions. All the pride I had hidden behind my service. All the arrogance of feeling more righteous than anyone else. They didn't speak, but I understood that I was being judged. Not for sins like stealing or lying, but for wrapping hatred in the garment of faith. He didn't know what to say. His tears fell slowly, not from sadness, but from the horror of something he couldn't understand. Then there was light. David said softly, the light didn't say anything, but I knew I was being given a chance to change, to come back, but not as the same person. Nancy kissed her husband's hand. God still gives you time, she whispered softly. But inside David, a storm was raging. He wanted to believe that the experience was just an illusion, a medical hallucination caused by brain trauma. But he knew it was not a dream. The feelings he experienced were too real, too tearing, too honest. A few days after he was discharged, David began contacting his closest friend, Pastor Samuel, a fellow minister from seminary. They met on David's porch as the sun was setting, in the conversation that ensued. Light between friends? I saw myself as a stranger, David told Samuel. And for the first time, I hated that man. Samuel tried to smile. You just went through a major trauma. The brain can create anything at that time. No, Sam, David interrupted firmly. This is not just trauma. It wasn't a casual conversation between friends. I saw myself as a stranger, David told Samuel. And for the first time, I hated the man. Samuel tried to smile. You've just been through a major trauma. The brain can create anything at that time. No, Sam, David interrupted firmly. This wasn't just a trauma. I've been doubting my own beliefs for years, but I never had the courage to admit it, even to myself. And now, after seeing what I saw, I feel like everything I thought was true might just be a comfortable version. The night wind blew, carrying the sound of crickets from the field behind the house. Samuel looked at his old friend with a look of mixed pity and fear. So, what are you going to do now? David sighed, then his eyes looked up at the night sky that was starting to be sprinkled with stars. I will slowly search for the answer, and I will not stop until I find the light. David W. Moore's life has officially begun an inner journey he never imagined. 7 minutes have changed everything. He is no longer the same priest. He is now a man who has seen the shadows of his own soul and never wants to return to that darkness again. Nothing can prepare a person for an experience that tears apart the line between life and death. David W. Moore, the man who had stood firm in the pulpit of the church with full confidence, now lay in the river room of his house, staring at the ceiling without saying a word. It had been 2 days since he was released from the hospital, but his mind had never really returned. Not because his body had not recovered, but because his heart was still left in an inexplicable space, a place beyond the limits of reason. That night, as the sound of crickets filled the air and the desert wind blew the smell of dry earth through the open window, David thought again about what he had experienced in those 7 minutes outside his body. He had told some of it to Nancy and Pastor Samuel, but there was one part he had not been able to express. The last part, the most shocking part. In the midst of the thick darkness, after the screams and regrets, after the images of the faces of the people he had hurt had stripped his conscience bare, there came a moment that he could not understand and could not forget. The light, it did not appear with a great explosion or flash like the heavenly images in movies or church paintings. The light came slowly, at first like a warm mist that seeped into the dark room, then became a light that touched without being blinding. The light had a presence, not a body, not a face, but a feeling, and that feeling penetrated him more deeply. From the loudest voice he had ever heard, David did not know where he got the assurance, but he knew the light was alive. The light was conscious. He saw no form, heard no voice, but he knew the entity was looking into him without judgment. Not like the beings before him who seemed to be probing and judging, but like a mother looking at her child with love, even though she knew the child had done wrong. And as that gaze touched his soul, David wept. He did not know why. There were no words, no punishment, but his whole being seemed to melt. The tears were not from fear, but from shame. Shame because all his life he thought he was pursuing the truth, when all he was pursuing was justification. He felt that the light knew everything about him, about his youthful idealism, about his ambition to build a church and expand his influence, about how he slowly traded humility for power in the pulpit, about how he refused to listen to other views just because he felt he already had the absolute truth. And in that silence, the light seemed to say without a word that he could still search, that this was not the end, that if he really wanted to know the truth, he would have to be willing to walk to places he had previously avoided, to open his heart to things he had previously rejected. Then the darkness collapsed, swept away by a strong wind. David felt his body being pulled at incredible speed, as if being thrown back to earth. The last light dazzled his eyes, and he woke up in an ambulance bed gasping for breath, and his body drenched in cold sweat. From that moment on, his consciousness changed. He no longer saw the world the same way. The blue sky above Midland seemed wider. The smiles of the children on the street seemed more sincere. And every time he heard the call to prayer from the small mosque on the outskirts of town that had previously irritated him, now the sound seemed to penetrate his heart in a way he could not explain. In the silence of his nights, David began to open books that he had only read to find errors. One of them was a translation of the Quran that had once been given to him by a Muslim student whom he had invited to church for a discussion. Before, he had only read it briefly to find loopholes. Now he read it to find answers. There was one verse that made him pause for a long time that night. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, the likeness of whose light. The light of a figure who radiated love without words, who guided him to see life differently. Now that light is no longer just a vision on the verge of death. It is present in every step David takes, in every prostration he makes, in every letter of the Quran he reads. That light is the faith that guides him, that strengthens him when the world rejects him, and that embraces him when he feels alone. One night, David sat on his porch. The Texas sky was clear and wide, dotted with stars that sparkled like tiny lights dancing in the distance. He looked up, smiling to himself. "I've lost so much," he murmured, "but I've also found everything." He didn't know what his future would hold. Maybe his life would continue to be a test, but this time he was ready. Not because he was stronger, but because he knew where to lean. He closed his eyes. Taking a deep breath, he reopened the Quran on his lap. He read slowly, his soft voice blending with the night breeze. "Whoever does good, whether male or female, while being a believer, we will give him a good life." Quran Surah An-Nahl, verse 97. David smiled. Now he knew that the death that had come to him was not the end. In fact, from there, his real life had just begun. In that new light, he walked slowly but surely, no longer looking at the past, but looking at the future with God Almighty, who had brought him together with the light after death. By Allah, I know. Hopefully this story is useful. I apologize if there are many shortcomings. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.